living 10 years in London with the noise and the traffic and underground, one had got used to a sort of a different, the sort of the madness that the British take for reality. You know, there's a sort of standard Greenwich mean gloom, you know, that everything's normal and anything a bit eccentric, you know, that doesn't conform with this, which is a particular form of sort of English madness, which is different to the Irish madness. Now, when you live in the Irish countryside, you sort of take the supernatural, the presence of fairies or banshees when people died. It's not at all odd, because in the Irish countryside it's sufficiently dark and sufficiently quiet for the sort of the other world to make its presence felt.
We came here, we were just married, and we were up in the greenhouses picking grapes. And she had her hand out, and she suddenly felt little fingers pulling off her wedding ring. And directly below her there was stone, and it never hit the floor. It should have gone pink. So we searched, we dug up the greenhouse, and I knew that greenhouse had often childish laughter been heard. So I said, well, it's the little people who live just one octave up, and they have sort of naughty sense of humour. So I went up and I said, now listen, very funny, we're all very amused. Now here's some silver for you, and I buried a few half-crowns and I lit some incense. I said, now can we please have our wedding ring back? I went back to the house, and a few days later Helen was turning out some old bags. And in this inner zip pocket here, there was our wedding ring. Explain that one away. But that's the sort of thing you expect to happen in Ireland.
Castle Leslie lies deep in the green rolling countryside of County Monaghan, almost on the border between southern and northern Ireland. It stands on the edge of a lake, a huge neo-Gothic pile that was built in the middle of the last century, on the site of a much older castle. And as with so many of these old houses, in Ireland and elsewhere, it seems to be an extraordinary focus of paranormal activity. People talk, for example, about the 18 ghosts of Castle Leslie that link the various generations of the family and their servants and retainers, stretching back across the years. Like, for example, the story of old Ned, the gardener.
Well, my two uncles, Uncle Ned and Pat, both were the top gardeners here. And as I say, they were here, I think they were there from about 14, and they were roughly there till 75 or so. And I remember we had moved from the village up to a new set of houses in the village, and we took them with us because they had got asthma. But my uncle Ned was dying, and we were sitting with him because he couldn't be left in the room on his own. And each night we sat there, he would be pulling at the bedclothes, and I would say, what are you doing? He said, I'm watering the roses, because the roses were fabulous here. And his job was looking really after all of the flowers and the hedges. And he'd be always watering the roses, and this fascinated us. We used to look at him and say, God, he really thinks he's in the garden. He's actually watering the roses. And I would go and say, Mum, Uncle Ned thinks he's in the garden. And she said, leave him alone, he probably is there. But then on the Monday, he was still working away as he thought in the gardens, and he said, around about 10 o'clock, Anne, I'm going to work. And I said, right. We used to tell him, oh yeah, okay, get ready. And just a few minutes after, I kind of looked, and he seemed to have just fell over, and I ran out and said, Mum, I think Ned's dead. And she said, oh, not at all. But she went in and he was. And about 20 minutes after that, the doorbell rang, and I went to the door, and I was in tears because we loved him. And Desmond Leslie was standing there with the red rose in his hand. And I said, oh, you're late. I said, he's just died. He says, no, I just met him in the roses. He says, I've just come from the gardens, and I just met him down there. He was walking through the rose bed. We couldn't believe it.
The Leslie family goes back a long, long way. They claim to be able to trace their ancestry back to Attila the Hun, one of the men who came out of the east to bring down the Roman Empire. But the estates in Ireland go back to the time of Charles II. They were part of a gift for fighting Cromwell. Originally, they were vast, but over the years they shrunk to about 1,000 acres around the castle and the village of Glasloch, which was built to house the workers on the estate. Generations of families in the village have worked in the big house, and many of the stories of paranormal events would suggest that they are woven into the very fabric of the place.
Well, there was an extraordinary continuity because a lot of the people about the place, and it had been right back from the time of my great-grandmother. In fact, only last year, Bridget, the housekeeper, died, who joined my great-grandmother's staff, you know, Lady Leonie Leslie, one of the Jerome sisters, and effectively ran the house. You know, Leslie's came and went, but the staff was sort of permanent. It was their house, really. And one often felt one was there on sufferance. One would creep down to the basement level, which within my lifetime was still had Annie, the cook, and the boy who polished the boots and lit the boiler in the morning. There was still the kind of the last vestiges of the upstairs, downstairs Victorian setup.
The kitchen which we have now for the dining room used to be the butler's bedroom, and the corridor along it seems to have quite a lot of activity on it. I think maybe one of the reasons is it was the corridor between the male and female servants, and the butler's bedroom was on the corridor, and what the old codger used to do was loosen the tiles, so as they tried to sneak up and down the corridor after hours, he would hear them, and of course there was great war if it was caught. So eventually what they did is they realised that if they got out one window and crawled along a parapet, they could avoid his bedroom. But both Jackie and I work in the kitchen, and quite often you'll see a fleeting shadow go up and down the corridor or get a sensation of somebody walking past. And when we had a freezer in the corridor about 2 years ago, I was counting something in the bottom of it, and the corridor is a door at either end of it, and I heard somebody come through the door and walk down the corridor behind me, and I saw the figure start to go past, and I thought it was Elton wearing his grey sweatshirt, and I called up to him that I wanted something, and the figure walked behind me and out the other side, and he didn't respond, so I stood up and looked round, and the figure had gone, and the door coming out of the corridor was shut firmly, and there's no way that there was a person that had walked past me. Give me a little bit of a fright.
I was actually showing a group of children around the basement, and we'd been here in the wine cellar, and you have to remember this was a very normal run. I could have done this 100 times, but on this particular occasion, and it was 5 o'clock on a sunny day, a summer's afternoon, high summer. As I say, this had all been done before. We finished the tour here in the wine cellar, and we stepped outside just to finish up with a little talk about the historical aspect of the basement. And just as these things happen, we just slipped into that other time, and I looked up, and he was standing there looking at us, and I knew it was a servant who had always been here. And my feeling was not these dreadful horror stories. It was a feeling of I'm trespassing here, and he's telling me that. I also felt foolish. What are you foolish people doing? It was very, you see, this was their territory, this was their home, and it still is.
Castle Leslie was in its heyday in Victorian and Edwardian times, and throughout the place there is a sense that those times haven't entirely gone away. There are countless stories, for example, of incidents that would seem to link the characters who occupied the house then with the people who live in it now. The story of Great Aunt Constance is a typical example.
The house was built by Lady Constance, and it is still very much her house. I think if you see her portrait, and I think she's still quite a strong presence here. And she died in, I think, 1927, and in around 1944 her son Sir John Leslie died, and his young wife was very ill, and she was in the mauve bedroom, just literally one above here. It was her favourite room, and that's where she wanted to spend the last of her days. And the nursemaid was sitting in a chair by the door, and a door opened, and a figure swept in and came over to the bed, and Leonie recognised her. And shortly afterwards, Leonie passed away, very quietly and peacefully. And the nurse assumed it was a member of the family, and hadn't said anything until after the funeral. She was in the dining room, and she pointed to the portrait on the left of the fireplace, and of course it was Constance that she'd seen at Leonie's bed. But it's the third time in this house alone where somebody has come back to take somebody else with them.
As several psychic investigators have put it, it's as if the entire fabric of the house has absorbed the colour and flavour of the people who've lived and died here over the generations. Every room has its story, and it seems they can be witnessed other than by members of the family. Many visitors to the house, for example, have very strange stories to tell.
Lucy and I were down here for the evening, and we'd gone to bed early and decided to read books. And we were cuddled up in bed, and I was reading her one of her Beatrix Potter books. I'd left the pile of the books on the side of the table, and I suddenly heard this dragging sound, and I thought, had one of the dogs come in or what had happened? And I heard it coming from the far side of the bed where Lucy was, and we both looked over at the same time and noticed that the books on the pile were sliding off the top one by one and just falling to the ground, and for no reason they just stopped. And Lucy then said to me, "Mummy, can you see the people?" But I couldn't see anyone there.
They were children. They were dressed in shiny jumpers and dresses. I saw them moving the books. They were sliding down to the ground. They fell off and disappeared out of the room. They went through the wall because they were magic. They were ghosts.
How do you know they were ghosts?
Because I looked at their faces and they were ghosts.
It was frightening, the sound, when we first heard it, because we didn't know what it was. But when I realised the books were dropping off the edge of the table, I knew there was no reason for it. And when Lucy said, "Look at the children," then it dawned on me that we were experiencing something really strange and inexplicable. But she was comfortable looking at these children which I couldn't see.
Here in Castle Leslie in Ireland, one of the family's more recent heroes is Uncle Norman. He became heir to the estate around the turn of the century, at about the time that he joined the Irish Fusiliers. When the Great War came, he went to France and took part in some of the very earliest fighting. He was never to see Castle Leslie again, because he died in a furious charge on a machine gun post, wielding his officer's sword in October 1914. But around the time of his death, there were many reports of his actually being seen walking the gardens in his family home.
I think one of my favourite stories here is about my great-uncle Norman. He was the second eldest son at the turn of the century, and his elder brother Shane didn't want the running of the estate, so it was passed to Norman. And Norman had joined the army and then graduated in 1906. The First World War came and he set off dutifully for war. And on the 18th of October that year, 1914, he was seen back here. And he was seen along the lake by Jimmy Vaughan, the old gamekeeper, and checking round the grounds.
Uncle Norman, you see, was killed at the very beginning of the First War, leading a charge with a sword, because the War Office didn't do quite good show for officers to carry guns, by gad, so, you know, up guards and at them. But it's not a very good thing for attacking a German machine gun nest. He came walking down that garden path there in broad sunlight one afternoon, and the old gamekeeper said, "Oh, Mr. Norman, you're home," and he smiled and walked on in.
And it was assumed that he was home on leave and checking his estate before he came to the house. And his room was gotten ready, and his mother was told, and there was great bustle in the house to prepare his meals. And there's still even a little note in her diary saying Norman's home. And that evening he never came to the house, and everybody feared the worst, and within a week the letter would come from the War Office to say he died early on the morning of October the 18th, hours before. He was seen here hours after he died.
The Norman story is typical of the ghosts of Castle Leslie. They all seem to involve people who have a profound spiritual or emotional connection with the place. And perhaps because there are so many people around the house, there are almost always multiple sightings.
None of the stories or sightings or hauntings in the present Castle Leslie are sort of sinister. The old Castle Leslie that was stood on the same site that was demolished in the 1600s, apparently was a sinister presence in the back stairs. And interestingly enough, one of the few spooky, frightening experiences that happened when I was living there is when they were repairing the roof in the 60s, the workmen refused to come after night, because right where the old castle stood in front, white figures were seen moving around where the back stairs had been, and they, refused to carry on working on the house after dark.
I don't think we have ever found that Castle Leslie was associated with anything unpleasant. I think that has to be said first off, because so many of the great houses of Ireland have really bloodthirsty, unpleasant stories attached to them. Castle Leslie is what you see, a lovely family estate with a kind of feeling of being cared for.
The fact that the Leslies were able to stay put in one house for 350 years, and it was a big enough house, at 96 rooms or whatever, to accommodate all their clutter without most people have to sort of purge to stay sane. They have to keep purging the clutter of different phases of their lives. With somehow at Castle Leslie, the sort of sediments of each generation remained to be hopefully not too much of an impediment for the next generation, meant that the sort of family memory, the folk memory, extends back over a much greater number of generations. So the feeling of reality of people in the past, because you know what they look like, their pictures are there, their clothes might be in a cupboard. This is the chair that fat Charlie Leslie had made in 1780 when he developed gout, and there you can see the leather patch where it was worn away, and you can see how fat he was because his breeches and waistcoat are still hanging in the cupboard, made him a real person. And I think that's the unique element to Castle Leslie. It's like a time capsule where the vibrations and objects of 350 years of interesting life remains. There's nothing to disturb it.
Many psychic investigators would argue that what you have at Castle Leslie is exactly what you'd expect to find. The house is filled with the relics and paraphernalia of the people who've lived and died here over the generations. And so you find a long history of coincidence and association building up to a very high level of expectation, creating an anthology of ghost stories, you might say, around births, marriages and deaths.
In many stately homes there is a real sense of history. There are big portraits of ancestors. There's lots of stories of what the ancestors have achieved, and so it's not difficult to believe that those people are still around, that they would have had strong emotional links with the house, and that's why their ghosts are there. But obviously these stories, the pictures, the books have a big influence on the people living in the house. There is a feeling those people are still around. They see some apparition or something at the top of the stairs, and so they sort of in their mind convert that to be the great-grandfather who was killed in the Battle of X, and that's why he's still coming back to see us. It doesn't mean these things are true. It may just be that the expectations bring on this sort of experience.
But that having been said, it's very important not to write off sightings of the same event by several different witnesses. And there are many stories that are immensely difficult to explain away. The witnesses are sane and balanced people. The events are apparently impossible. Take Patch the dog, for example.
Late one night I was sitting on a box painting the skirting boards in the bathroom, and the next thing I saw Jack Russell jump off the floor and land on my knee. And just as he landed on my knee, he disappeared. And I looked at my friend, and we both decided it was too late and we needed some sleep, and we both should go to bed. So that's fine, we went to bed and didn't think too much about it. And a few days later, she was in the bathroom, and the radio was on the bathroom floor, and it was tuned out of a station. It was just making lots of noise. And as she walked in, the next thing she heard something go, "Patch! Patch!" And it was like somebody calling, and calling quite desperately, and she shouted at me, and I ran up, and I just heard one or two calls at the end as it faded out. A number of weeks later, you'd be lying in bed, and the next thing you'd hear something scratching on the floor. You'd hear on the floor. And one particular night I was sitting in bed reading my book, and the light was on, and I could hear where the scratching was coming from, and I assumed it was mice or something, so I threw the book at it. Nothing happened, and a few minutes later the scratching resumed, so I shouted to my friend who was in the other room, and she came in, and the two of us shared the bed that night. And then the next thing in the middle of the night, she woke me up because she heard the scratching on the floor. And all these little fragments didn't really make sense until one day I bumped into my aunt, and she said, "Oh, we hear you've got a new small dog. We hear him yapping and barking sometimes." And I said, "Well, we haven't really got a small dog, but we do have a small problem." And I started to tell her the story of the dog being seen, and the scratching and the barking and everything else. And she said, "Well, that's very strange, because her father, my great-uncle Seymour, as a small boy, had a little brown and white Jack Russell called Patch, and he'd had TB as a child, and for some reason some of the boys were taunting him and teasing him, and they decided they would taunt his dog. and things went badly wrong and they killed the dog by mistake. And of course the dog's name was Patch.
The events surrounding the burial of Aunt Anita are of a very different category. All we can say is that there seemed to be a surprising conjunction of natural events witnessed by many people. It was a still, calm summer's day. Aunt Anita was about to be buried across the lake.
My Aunt Anita was the primary person in residence there when I was a young child, and she was a remarkable and charming and beautiful woman, great sort of writer of historical works, and was a great sort of focus of the family. When she died 10 years ago, she insisted on being buried because of the Red Indian heritage in the family. She wanted to be buried between the roots of 2 trees. And we had a very remarkable and moving burial service for her on the banks of the lake, looking across at the castle. And at the climactic moment where my father read out a particular poem that my aunt had wanted read about her soul rising and going home, a sort of wind spout came up the lake, which under them been mirror calm, and all the autumn leaves got sucked off the trees as of one, formed a great sort of golden vortex that came right over where the funeral was and sort of shot up, cascaded up into the air. Now, this was a perfectly natural phenomenon. Stranger is that the timing of that this tornado should pass up the lake at the climactic moment of the funeral, sucking all the leaves, and the lake that had up until that moment been mirror calm boils, you know. So if a hand had come out of the lake with a sword, you know, and had taken the prayer book away, nobody would have batted an eyelid. And all the Irish were saying, "Ah, there goes Anita's soul," and they all sort of waved bye-bye to the leaves. But we coming from London, but I mean, this can't be happening. I mean, look, good grief. And everybody thought we were just a bit, you know, and it was just the difference between passing through the sort of psychic force field from, say, a busy urban life to kind of rural Ireland.
There is no doubt that Castle Leslie is a beautiful and romantic place, and a place where it's immensely difficult to unravel fact from Celtic mystery. But many of the stories that cluster around it are little different from the kinds of stories that in our research we find linked to many old family houses right across Europe. Most of them can perhaps be written off as coincidence or anecdote or embroidery of a half-remembered event, but not all. We are left with that mysterious core of stories that would seem to defy rational explanation.